Figured we would spend some time talking a little bit about some of the Endangered Species Act stuff. Main reason being we now have a label, which means we now know what some of these real world things that we have to deal with are now that we've gotten the first label. So let Sarah lead making the slides. So it's her name up here. That also means she gets all the blame and all the hard questions. Main reason I wanted to kind of share this time with Sarah is she's one of the weed scientists that's probably spent more time than any on phone calls with the EPA as this whole process has developed over the last really 3 years or beyond. And so we're going to kind of go back and forth, and we'll change color slides so we know when one of us is jumping off and the other one is jumping back on. So I'm going to start. So first of all, anyone who was at this meeting last year, Andrew Thorstensen gave a talk that gave the history of why we're kind of talking about new regulations for pesticides, what the Endangered Species Act is, what these court cases are all about. So this slide, that QR code, brings you to a recording of Andrew's presentation last year. So if you want the history of kind of how this is developed, all the different court cases that got us here, and kind of why we're talking about this moving into the future, that's what this QR code will bring you to for that presentation. So anyone with some real history, that's where to go. And now I'm going to pass it over to Sarah, and we're just going to go back and forth. We're not intending to take the whole half hour here, because if there are any questions, this is a pretty in-depth topic, and so we encourage questions. If there are none, then we'll probably gain 5 or 10 minutes back and keep the program moving.
Yeah, I think that's good. And Joe, feel free to bump me out of the way here as I forget to say things or whatever. So I've got like a 30-second history lesson on this, and then we'll talk drift mitigation with Liberty, runoff mitigation with atrazine. And we've got some like Kansas examples and North Dakota examples. So this is kind of how I've been setting up ESA concerns for my farmers in Kansas. This act has been around for a long time. Some things to think about. One of the reasons this affects weed scientists more maybe than some other folks, and why the EPA started with herbicides, is because about half of the plants on half of the listed species, so threatened and endangered species, are plants, okay? And if we think this is hitting us bad here in the contiguous 48 states, I don't want to be in Hawaii, because half of the species on the list, or 40% of the species on the list, are in Hawaii. So this is part of why I think this has taken so long to kind of come together and to happen, is because there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of big bureaucratic organizations that are involved in this. So you've got your registrants, right? You've got EPA and USDA and their role in registering herbicides. And then the Endangered Species Act is really a Fish and Wildlife Services and NOAA responsibility. And then obviously we have end users, farmers, applicators. But the courts have stepped in, and I'm guessing this is what Andrew's recording will largely talk about, is the history of the court cases and the timeline there. Long story short, the courts have told the EPA, quit making excuses, you have to do this. So from my view, we've really got a couple of choices here. We can either have the EPA start taking tools away, or we can figure out how to live within some of these additional regulations. Joe has mentioned that this has been several years in the making. And one of the things I would say is that where we are in January of 2025 is significantly more workable than where we were in, say, January of 2022. Yeah. So to the agency's credit, they took feedback from us, from the registrants, from the farm organizations, and have tried to make it work and tried to be responsive. So I think where we are today is much more doable than where we were several years ago. So this is just a map that shows where the endangered species are located within the continental US. So I like to tell my farmers in Kansas, right, just be glad we don't live in the Everglades, right? Life would be a whole lot worse. Joe was making the point that you guys are probably better off than my folks. So I guess it's all relative. This is a list of the species that would be threatened and endangered in Kansas. Some to point out on this list: Mead's milkweed was part of the EPA, had sort of kind of like a focus group of endangered species that they were using early on to kind of test this out. I heard somebody earlier today mention the Western Prairie Fringed Orchid, the whooping crane, the Lesser Prairie chicken gets some attention in Kansas. The critter that's pictured on the slide is the American burying beetle. And I don't recall, Joe, how much of a hubbub he caused up here when the endless labels first came out, but I know I had about 10 counties in Kansas that were not happy.
None up here, but we weren't too far away from that being an issue.
Okay.
Geographically.
So yeah, we had 10 counties that from, I don't know, whenever that label came out in the winter until too close for comfort in the spring, thought they weren't going to be able to use the Enlist products. The other one that I have highlighted on this list is a monarch butterfly. So we've got a slide here in a few minutes to talk about some of the recent changes there.
So this is just North Dakota flavor. Again, just kind of highlighting, we're going to have some comparisons of Kansas, North Dakota. Overall, fewer endangered species. I kind of broke it down by type of plant or animal, and apparently didn't correct my burbs for birds. But just showing that we kind of have a mix of some plants, and really the main plant for us is the prairie orchid. And for those folks in Richland and Ransom County, you've seen some additional label restrictions on some products just throughout history for that orchid, but now we're kind of looking at protecting some of these invertebrates. And again, we also have the monarch, and that's Sarah's been more involved in those conversations of what that means. And I think that's the next slide. So just wanted to give our spin on what we're looking at here. Did not put slides together for Minnesota or South Dakota because I don't want to get into that.
The other thing I would say, and I don't know if you've seen this map for North Dakota, but there is every single county in the state of Kansas has at least one species from this list. And so every single county will be impacted at some point. The monarch, this just came out. This is a proposed listing. So a lot like our herbicide labels, it's in a comment period. So I'm sure that the farm organizations are working on that. But basically, it's illegal. If this goes through, or the proposal is that it would be illegal to take monarchs, which basically means to harm them, to kill them, to prevent their reproduction. Okay. Some things that I need to get a hold of somebody and ask some questions about. Let's see. Does this work? Yeah. So this line here about things that don't result in the conversion of native or naturalized grassland, shrubland, or forested habitat. You know, in Kansas, we have a lot of acres of CRP that would be considered naturalized grasslands. So if we're doing things that are disturbing that naturalized grasslands, to me, this implies that we could have some concerns and some issues there. So I think that's one thing we need to think about from a management and a farm standpoint. Bottom line, though, when we start to see changes on labels, earliest would be 2026. So next year. Keep going?
Yep.
All right. So herbicide strategy. So this is the EPA's plan, how they're going to attack getting all these herbicides done. They are so stinking far behind on registrations and re-registrations. This strategy is supposed to help them get caught up. Some things to point out, what I've been pointing out to my folks this winter is the last two bullets, really. This one right here, it's not self-implementing. So what that means is that this new label language is going to roll out over time. So as they approve new herbicides, that's when the labels are going to change. So it's not like the herbicide strategy was approved in August of 24, and so in 2025, all the labels will be changed. It's going to happen over time. And then the last thing, like you might have seen on the outline slide, there's really two big areas that we need to be worried about. One is drift mitigation, the other is runoff mitigation. And that's because fields are not habitat, right? And so you don't expect to find endangered species in the field, and it would not be necessary to treat those like habitat. So some general thoughts on the drift reduction requirements. We know that there's going to be minimum droplet sizes. There's maximum wind speeds. On the Liberty Ultra label, it specifically says 3 to 15 miles per hour. There are maximum release height requirements, right? We know the further we are from the target, the more likely we are to have drift. And then there's this idea of spray buffers. And the spray buffer distance is going to vary from product to product. It varies with the type of application. The upside there, and the next slide I think is going to say this, you can reduce that buffer requirement. So I think that's a plus. But we've seen these buffer requirements on the extend labels, on the enlist labels. The things that are included in those buffer areas is pretty much the same as those labels. So this is what I think makes this drift mitigation piece something that will be, I don't want to say a non-issue because you'll need to document it. It might have to make some major changes, but I think it's easily attainable for at least most of my applicators. Are these ways that you can get a percentage reduction in buffer distance. So going to a coarser droplet size, using a DRA, hooded sprayers, downwind windbreaks, reducing the proportion of the field that is treated. So whether that's a banded application or a targeted application, reducing the application rate makes my skin crawl a little bit. I don't think that's the best idea. And then paying attention to relative humidity at the time of application. So do you want to do this one?
Yeah, we can just, my next one is basically the same.
Okay,
So
then go.
Sarah and I are a little bit redundant here, so we'll get back to the proper colors of green and gold.
Is that how you treat all your guests?
We gave you a coach. Actually, our coach was up here earlier. I don't know if you ran into him. Don't take him with you either. So Liberty Ultra, this is not to pick on this product. They were just the first ones to get a registration through this herbicide strategy. So in our conversations with the EPA, basically every new product from Liberty Ultra on forward will have similar label language. Every time a product gets re-registered, similar language will be seen. So this is going to take essentially 15 years for every product to have the same label language based on where they're at in the 15-year cycle of being re-registered.
That's assuming they're on time and caught up.
That's assuming they're on time and caught up. I'm going to talk about some pinch points a little bit during my talk of just new and registration and re-registration. So some of the things I've been pointing out is let's get comfortable with spray drift management and runoff. So what Sarah showed, some of the early conversations, if you kind of remember when the extended max and Genie labels were renewed a couple years ago, we were talking 330 foot or longer buffers at times with some products. So overall, I've said Liberty Ultra has been very forgiving compared to what we were kind of prepped for on what most products are going to be looking at. That being said, we have no idea the next product, how these buffers may change. So it may be a case where we have, in this case, 10-foot downwind buffer for Liberty Ultra. That's pretty easy for most of us to get to. The next product might be at that 320 foot. So there's still some unknowns since this is the first one, but we get a glimpse of what this might look like. So overall, I've said this one is pretty easy for us to meet this drift reduction. So aerial 50 feet, ground 10 feet. There below there is a list of what can be part of a buffer. And so if you have a grass border around your field, you mow it, that can be a buffer too. So 10 feet, pretty easy for us to reach, and aerial was, all things considered, pretty easy as well. There's a couple things at the bottom are what we can use to get our buffer down to 0 feet. So things like a managed windbreak or shelter belt is one of these things that we can use. There is the specific language right now is an oil emulsion DRA at actually the use rate is way too high, but the regulatory folks have been alerted to that, and we're going to get that rate adjusted down to a proper level. Right now, it's essentially a 10x rate of how we use those products on the label, but that should be taken care of by the time we get into the season. So right now, for this product, a specific type of DRA or class of DRA, but that's probably going to change. So I'm guessing all DRAs in future products. That's my crystal ball on that part of it. You want to switch over to runoff, and I can do the specifics?
Okay. So runoff requirements, the scale is 0 to 9. So some products will be 0. Some products could be up to 9. I haven't, in the Liberty Ultra and then the potential proposed atrazine mitigations, I haven't seen anything that's a 9 yet. The website listed here is going to take you guys to the EPA's mitigation menu. That's what they're calling it. And so, we're supposed to pick items off of that list that are worth certain points to get us to what the label requires. And there are a few things that can be done to not have to have mitigation points, mitigation points. Okay.
Yeah, and so Sarah mentioned future products we might get up to 9. We'll show atrazine, that current proposal. But again, for us, for the case of Liberty Ultra, that magic number is 3. And this has been largely simplified from what they were originally telling us. And so this is just a map of all counties in the U.S. EPA has gone through and classified your inherent risk of impacting endangered species. And so we're not in any of the high-risk counties. That's good for us. But basically, living in a certain county, you get a certain number of points just for making that application in that county. And so if we're in a low-risk county and we have some of these, I'll show a more up-close map from North Dakota. If you're in a yellow county, that means you get 3 points just for farming in that county, and that's all you need for Liberty Ultra. So overall, again, very forgiving compared to some of the more advanced measures we were talking about a year or two ago for potential consideration. Just a bigger picture of that map. This is available on that website Sarah had indicated. Do you want to go through Kansas or just skip for this point?
No, I think you can.
Just a brief.
Yeah,
highlight.
I was just going to say, so we're different than you guys, right? We have this whole chunk of my state that gets 0 points, but my guys out west get 3. So just like you said, they're good for Liberty Ultra.
And here's just the North Dakota map. So we're basically all lower medium. So if you're in that yellow county, you've got your 3 points. Runoff mitigation for Liberty Ultra is taken care of. Could change as new products get new requirements. The light blue, that's our medium counties. That's 2 points. And we'll show a few ways to get that additional 1 point. And that's a pretty easy bar to meet as well. You know, something like having a flat field gets you a point. So if you farm in the Red River Valley, you're good for runoff mitigation. I think that's basically what's here. This is not a comprehensive list on the screen, but other measures to get some additional points. If you track it, if you just document, hey, I went through and made sure I'm good, that's a point. So for this product, relatively low bar to meet. The one I wanted to point out was that second bullet point, working with a technical specialist. This I will give a lot of credit to our CCA group here in the state. When we were having conversations, weed scientists have had conversations, CCA groups with the EPA, and said, what if you use a CCA? They know things about runoff. So if you work with a CCA, that's 1 point. And our group was at that table to really get that across the line too. So got to give a lot of due credit there. But again, most of us are 2 or 3. That last point is relatively easy to meet for this product label. This is just rounding out the list.
Yeah, this is just rounding out the list. I just went and tried to make it easy maybe to see the list that's online. I think the other thing to point out, that 1 point, I mean, I have pointed out to my extension agents that they count as an expert in that 1 point category. Oops. And then the previous ones were kind of agronomic things you can do. There's a whole list of conservation practices. Again, anything to try to keep that water on the field. Things to note is that the EPA has agreed that they will use the NRCS definitions for each of those practices. So at one point they were trying to figure out like, well, what constitutes conservation tillage? So they came to agreement that they will use the NRCS definitions for all of those measures.
And the last thing, just briefly, that there's another website we go to within 6 months of making an application, because there are times, some of those were birds and insects and they migrate. And so we might be at a higher risk if an insect needs to breed on a certain flower. And so there's a website we go to check it. I hope they increase the speed of this website. Bulletin's live too. It's overall a pretty slow website. And right now you have to know your registration number. So for Liberty Ultra, that's 7969-500. And you can't type in Liberty Ultra, you have to do the registration number. What that looks like, you enter the right registration number. Here's just kind of a zoomed out picture with Fargo in the middle. If we had a certain, so if we had a limitation area, we'd have a kind of a darker red box with a yellow border. I looked at to June 2025, no such limitation exists. I looked at July last night because you can go 6 months out. We don't really have these limitation areas for that product. So that could be, again, something different for future products. Right now, not much of a concern.
So, okay, I did the same thing for Liberty in Kansas, and I couldn't find one. The closest one I could find was in Tennessee. So I think for Liberty, I think this was a good one to start with.
Yes.
Okay, so
wheels.
so the atrazine registration review. Atrazine seems like it's always in registration review. This is the latest proposal. It's in the comment period now. Key changes that affect my farmers is this proposed reduction in the application rate from annual application rate from 2.5 pounds down to 2 pounds. And then we've been talking a lot about these watersheds on the map here on the right-hand side. So, you can see the purple would be what I would consider like a moderate concern for the EPA. The teal color would be watersheds that tend to have a higher concentration of atrazine in them. And so you can see like 2/3 or 3/4 of my state is going to be affected by this. And what watershed you're in or what category of watershed you're in affects how many runoff mitigation points the label will tell you to have. And so this is just what that map looks like for Kansas. The proposed label has a state by state, county by county list of the ranges of points that are possible. So you can see it goes from 0 up to 6 for Kansas.
Again, we're pretty fortunate. We had 4 counties even make that list. And it's basically those ones that go into that area of the Red River that you saw on the map that was kind of highlighted. So we're not using 2 pounds of atrazine up here. EPA's original model assumed we use 2.5 pounds every application, every acre. So that's where it was important for us to come to the table and say, we're not using anywhere close to that up here. So we need to kind of refigure the models. And so we went from a lot of counties and a lot of rivers down to 4. That's going to be 0 or 3 points. Assuming it's that same point system, basically by farming in those counties, you're there already. So right now it's looking pretty decent for us. I did check across the river, same counties. I haven't gone outside the Red River Valley watershed, but that's kind of what we're looking at in this geography. Oh, that was a text version. Redundant. This is your slide.
Yeah, we don't have to talk about that.
It's not your living room, is it?
So, all of these label requirement talks feel kind of heavy and boring and preachy and not very comfortable, and nobody wants to do these things. But I think it is important. And so my analogy for that is I don't think my living room has ever looked quite this bad, but I have two boys that live in my house. One is 9 and one is 12. So people are shaking their heads like they get it. This is what children can do. But here's the thing. In my house, my 9-year-old is probably responsible for 90% of that mess. But my 12-year-old suffers the consequences too, right? And I think the EPA has kind of illustrated for us that this is going to be their playbook going forward. Even though 1 or 2 people may be responsible for half of the mess, I think they've demonstrated they're willing to pull products and not label products if they think that it's not workable the way they're being used. So I know that it's a pain in the neck for folks to do these things, but the pain in the neck we have now is way better than the nightmare that they initially proposed. So I think they made a good faith effort to meet us, and I think we need to make a good faith effort to try to meet them.
Yeah. And then we went maybe a little longer than we thought we would, but again, kind of the key point here is why are they doing this? Because otherwise, as soon as a product hits the market, it's going into court, and we might get it taken away that way. And so this is their effort to make sure any new label won't get taken away in that method. And so it is a good faith effort on their part. And I think that's about the last thing I had to talk about there. So we're going to transition over to get Zach's slides up, but we did have about 5 minutes for questions. If anyone wanted to ask any. Yes, sir. So the question was, is this anything with an EPA registration number, including fungicides, insecticides? You probably have a little bit better. Short answer is yes.
Short answer is yes. I think the insecticide strategy is either has recently been finalized or is scheduled to be finalized soon. Then they're going to move on to fungicides. Hawaii has their very own strategy that is like the last thing they're going to tackle. But they started with herbicides. So,
Dave.
Yeah, 2 quick questions. Was there something on the wind speed, how often you had to take it that was on the label on that?
Did you read that?
Something was really outrageous. And then the other thing is about the condition situation that they're taking water solubility of the herbicide. You think about Liberty and other products. Whether the water solubility is high or low. Are they talking about catchment KOC values on the soil and moving runoff? Some things don't seem to make sense in terms of that. You want to address those 2 things?
You want to go first?
Did you read I didn't read the.
So I read the fine point on the wind part, and it is kind of crazy. It's a recommendation, not a requirement to check it. I think it was every 15 minutes, and I almost laughed so hard I fell on the floor. Yeah, every 15 minutes was the
That's not a
recommendation.
requirement, that's just a recommendation.
That's the recommendation. So there are some requirements about where those measures are supposed to be taken, like at boom height, not blocked. So, but yeah, every 15 minutes was the rec.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so kind of the follow-up was looking at herbicide properties of water solubility, KOC. Are we lumping those together? And I kind of heard some indications of both, but I can say they did pick on paraquat specifically. We know that binds immediately to soil. Anticipate no runoff mitigation necessary for paraquat. So you would think similar products would be in that same regard. I think as far as high water solubility or potential to run off through erosion, I think atrazine will be pretty telling for us as far as what they're really thinking. And then in between, hard to tell exactly what the details are.